A broken terracotta pot is not gravel. Terracotta drinks. Where you put the pieces decides whether they store water for your plant or trap it away from the roots, creating an anaerobic swamp. The physics suggests that, distributed through the soil, you can secure 14 extra days of moisture retention when used correctly. But if you fall for the old trick and stack them at the bottom of the container, you're creating an invisible barrier that halts the downward flow of water and drowns your plants from the bottom up. You have likely seen this advice everywhere. Save the curved shards of your broken pots and layer them carefully over the drainage hole before adding your potting soil. The logic seems sound on the surface. The large, curved pieces create cavernous air gaps, and air gaps mean water can escape easily, preventing the delicate roots from sitting in saturated sludge. But this widespread assumption misses the fundamental physics of how water actually moves through different materials in a confined space. When you place a highly porous material like fired clay at the very bottom of a continuous soil column, you're not building an efficient drainage system. You're inadvertently constructing a hydrological dam. Your soil is behaving exactly as physics dictates, and the water is doing what it always does when it hits an abrupt change in texture. Instead of flowing out the bottom, it pools directly above the shards, stopping dead in its tracks. The physics governing this interaction is settled. Water moves through soil via the competing forces of capillary action and gravity. Capillary action is the upward and lateral tension that pulls water into tiny spaces, holding it there tightly against the downward pull of gravity. Soil particles create thousands of microscopic pathways that pull water tight. When water reaches the bottom of the soil profile and encounters the large, cavernous, macroscopic air gaps created by the stacked terracotta shards, that capillary action abruptly stops. The water will not cross the open air gap until the soil above is saturated, reaching what is known as field capacity, and the sheer weight of gravity finally forces the water to bridge the gap and drop down. But here's where terracotta drastically differs from a simple layer of inert rocks or river gravel. Terracotta is porous clay. To understand why it is porous, you must look at how it is made. It is clay fired at a temperature lower than porcelain or glass, which means it hardens but does not fully vitrify. The water that was originally mixed into the raw clay boils off during the firing process, leaving behind millions of microscopic voids and channels throughout the solid material. It is essentially a hard, brittle sponge. When you place it in the soil environment, it does not just sit there taking up space like a stone. It actively interacts with the moisture profile around it. A single unglazed shard can hold between 10 to 15% of its own weight in water. Published soil research reports that porous ceramics powerfully pull moisture from the surrounding environment via capillary suction and hold it securely within their internal structure. This specific trait only works with unglazed terracotta. A glazed pot won't let water through. The shiny glaze permanently seals the pores, turning the ceramic into an inert barrier, much like a smooth river rock. But the unglazed pieces are thirsty. When you stack them at the bottom, they pull the water that eventually drops from the saturated soil above, filling their own internal microscopic pores before letting any water escape the container. You have essentially created a water logging zone precisely where you do not want it, at the deepest point of the pot where oxygen is already scarce. When you stack these shards at the bottom, you create the exact same perched water table that occurs when you line a pot with coarse gravel. The soil, resting just above the terracotta shards, remains constantly saturated, because the capillary pull of the fine potting soil is vastly stronger than the gravity, trying to pull the water down into the macroscopic air spaces between the shards. The roots sitting in this bottom layer of soil are deprived of oxygen. Over time, the environment goes anaerobic, breeding root rot. Let us look at the precise chronology of this hidden destructive process. On day 1, you water the container thoroughly. The water moves smoothly down through the soil profile, hits the terracotta layer at the bottom, and abruptly stops. The soil at the bottom saturates as it waits for gravity to overcome the capillary tension. Simultaneously, the terracotta shards begin to actively absorb the moisture, filling their thousands of micropores and swelling with water. By day 5, the top of your soil feels dry to the touch, and the plant might even show a slight droop in the afternoon sun, prompting you to water again. But the bottom 2 inches, resting directly above those stacked shards, are still holding maximum water capacity. The water is trapped. By day 14, the continued cycle of top watering while the bottom remains fully saturated begins to suffocate the deeper root system. The lack of oxygen causes the roots to die back. The plant shows severe signs of wilting, which is the ultimate physical irony. A plant wilting from lack of oxygen due to too much water at the base, prompting the confused gardener to add even more water to the top. The mechanism always precedes the symptom. The physical block happens on day 1. The visible decline of the plant might take 3 weeks to manifest fully, and because the shards are buried deep beneath the surface, the structural cause of the problem remains invisible to the observer. But the porosity of terracotta is not an inherent flaw. It is a physical advantage if you change the spatial arrangement. If you distribute smaller pieces of broken terracotta evenly throughout the middle of the soil profile, rather than stacking them at the bottom, they transform from a barrier into an efficient moisture reservoir. Imagine a detailed cross-section of your container. On the left side, we have the stacked shards at the bottom. A thick, dense, perched water table sits heavily right above them, suffocating the roots, while the top half of the soil dries out rapidly under the sun. The water cannot bridge the air gaps below until the soil is drowning. On the right side, we have a cross-section where the unglazed terracotta pieces have been broken down to the size of large coins and mixed evenly throughout the middle third of the soil column. Here, there is no abrupt textural boundary at the bottom of the pot to halt drainage. Water flows freely through the continuous soil column and safely out the drainage holes as intended. As the water passes through the middle section, those evenly distributed terracotta pieces act like thousands of tiny, thirsty sponges. They rapidly absorb moisture into their micropores. Because they are surrounded by fine soil rather than cavernous air gaps, the chain of capillary action remains unbroken and intact. The absorption phase is surprisingly rapid. A dry shard of unglazed terracotta can reach its maximum holding capacity within just a few hours of contact with saturated soil. This means that during a heavy rainstorm or a deep watering session, the shards quickly pull in excess moisture before it has a chance to drain away completely, essentially banking the water for later use. Over the next week, as the surrounding soil begins to dry out from evaporation and active plant transpiration, the dynamics shift. The capillary tension in the drying soil becomes physically stronger than the tension holding the water inside the terracotta. The dry soil physically pulls the water back out of the clay shards, providing a slow, steady, consistent release of moisture exactly where the feeder roots are actively seeking it. This release cycle is much slower than the absorption phase. While the clay drinks quickly, It surrenders its stored water gradually over several days as the surrounding soil demands it. This constant push and pull stabilizes the moisture curve of the entire container. What this means for your watering frequency is profound. Instead of riding a seesaw between saturation and drought, the soil remains consistently damp for longer periods. You might find that a container that previously needed watering every 2 days can now go 5 or 6 days without the plants showing any signs of drought stress, all because the distributed terracotta is actively managing the hidden moisture reserves. If understanding the physics of soil helps you work with your garden rather than against it, consider subscribing. Next time, we will look at that old coconut doormat on your porch and how it behaves exactly like the premium coir you buy at the garden center. The physical rule for repurposing broken terracotta is simple. Distribute, never stack. By breaking the shards into much smaller pieces and integrating them deeply into the soil matrix, you eliminate the textural discontinuity that causes perched water tables and root rot. Instead, you directly harness the inherent porosity of the unglazed clay to work in your favor. The ideal size for these shards is critical. You want them roughly the size of a large coin, about 1 inch across. If they are too large, they create the very air gaps we're trying to avoid. If they are crushed into dust, they will clump and impede drainage. At the 1 inch size, they provide the perfect surface area for absorption while allowing roots to navigate easily around them. Spacing is equally important. You do not want a dense cluster of shards. Aim for an even distribution where the pieces are suspended in the soil matrix, separated by 1 inch or 2 of potting mix. Depth placement varies slightly depending on whether you're filling a container or a raised garden bed. In a container, mix the shards primarily into the middle third of the pot. Avoid the top surface, where they will dry out too rapidly and heat up in the sun, and avoid the very bottom, where they might accidentally form a barrier. In an outdoor raised bed, integrate them into the 4 to 8 inch depth range. This is the active root zone where moisture buffering is most necessary during a summer drought. This entire mechanism relies on one crucial detail. This only works with unglazed terracotta. A glazed pot won't let water through. The decorative, shiny glaze permanently seals the ceramic pores, turning the piece into an impermeable shield. Using glazed shards will not bank moisture. It will only create obstacles for the roots. To identify unglazed terracotta with certainty, look for a dull, matte finish on both the inside and outside of the pot, and perform a physical test. Place a single drop of water on the dry surface. If the water beads up and sits there, the clay is sealed and useless for this purpose. But if the water rapidly darkens the clay and absorbs within seconds, you have the highly porous material required for your moisture reservoir. The speed of this initial absorption directly dictates how efficiently the shards will function underground. In a hot, dry period, this dispersed reservoir system can grant you up to 14 extra days of functional moisture retention without the risk of drowning your plants. The terracotta holds the water tight enough to prevent it from draining away immediately into the subsoil, but loosely enough that the fine roots and surrounding soil can easily pull it back when needed. It is a perfect hydraulic buffer. You're not creating an anaerobic swamp at the base of your pot. You're creating a high-functioning, slow-release hydration system throughout the active root zone. When you prepare your next container or garden bed, take a hammer to those broken pieces. Break them down until they are no larger than a standard coin. Mix them thoroughly into the middle depth of your soil profile, ensuring they are evenly spaced. Let the specific physical properties of the fired clay work to your advantage, storing the exact volume of water your soil needs, right in the root zone where it belongs, while allowing the excess to drain away freely. How many unbroken, usable pots do you currently have sitting empty, and how many broken ones are you hoarding for drainage? Be honest.